So the written interviews followed Omniversity. I think it was 3 or 4 years later, correct?
The first one was in '07, and I started that because I was working for this. Well, I had been asked to do some stuff for this Monsters and Critics website, which is I knew it was a crap site then. It's gotten only worse over the last decade. Jessica ended up working for them for 2 or 3 years, being their books editor. Originally, I did it. And I did the first two interviews for them. The first one with Charles Johnson, the second one with Daniel Dennett. But after that, they didn't want to do it anymore. I was like, well, I'm not. I want to do something interesting and deep. I'm not just going to rewrite, AP articles on shit books that basically Jessica would mix around a few words, add in a sentence or two, and that's what they wanted as content. So I did the first two interviews with Charles Johnson, the novelist, and the philosopher Daniel Dennett for them, and then afterwards I just started it as the Dan Schneider interviews, and I used both of them. So I don't even want to start with.
Talk about a little bit of the behind the scenes of these interviews. Did you send all the questions all at once, or was it a fluid thing and based on the recipient? Did you send
No,
one
I
question at a
structured the
time?
interviews. Most people are terrible at getting back. I did 41 of those written interviews in seven 41 in 7.5 years, something like that. Uh, and I've done now 91 or 92 Dan Schneider video interviews in a little over a year and a half. So I would structure them to flow as a natural conversation. Many of these people, even those that were writers like Charles Johnson, they didn't want to answer this question or they didn't want to. I mean, they didn't. It was hard to get people to understand that we're doing. I wasn't going to do a back and forth email thing. It would have taken even much longer. The only person that I did that for was the guy Larry Sanger, who co-founded Wikipedia. He wanted the interview broken up into 4 or 5 pieces because apparently he's got some nervous tick, or he gets overwhelmed with anxieties if there's too many questions. So that took like 2.5 years to get his shit together in like 4 or 5 parts. I had to break it up with. And so there were a lot of people that just had these personal issues, these wacky tendencies or whatnot. Johnson was an interesting guy. I remember when he finished, it was a very good interview, and uh, I asked if he would. Jessica emailed him and asked if he would look at her books. So she had written a few books with black characters, and he never got back to her on that. And not that he was obligated to, but her books even then were maybe just a notch below his two best books and better than anything else that he'd written after his top two books. And he didn't have that kind of I want to help out a younger writer kind of thing. So I know Jessica found him to be a bit. She didn't like that. Daniel Dennett, I've talked about him famously. There were a number of questions he didn't answer, and then he tried to be funny with some of his answers, with one-word answers. The most infamous one I've mentioned a few times that I got, a few dozen emails about was the question about Genghis Khan. He was on this show with Steven Pinker and a handful of other people at the turn of the millennium, and I asked him, well, why didn't you guys mention Genghis Khan? And what I laid out the reason, and I used this question in at least half the interviews. But none of these people can make these connections. This is the thing that I find, even when we talk about the video interviews, it's very difficult for people to make these connections, to bring things together. And this is what makes me a great poet and a great writer and a great artist, is that I can bring these things together. Daniel Dennett is very good in a laser-like way. If it's in his wheelhouse talking about brain theory, he's very good. Once you get outside of it, you might as well be talking to, a clown on Coney Island, because he has no clue what the fuck he's talking about. And he tried to be humorous in blowing off the Genghis Khan question, and he just made it just comes off so dead, and he comes off so lifeless in it. And so those are the first two interviews that I remember. When I go to the third interview, Pete Hamill was a good interview. But Pete Hamill, I thought, wasn't even going to send an interview. He had the interview for about a year and a quarter.
Let me just ask a question about Daniel Dennett. Daniel Dennett, he has gotten far worse throughout the years. The whole multiple drafts theory has been disputed.
Yeah.
He I want to also ask, and I want to kind of have this as a strain throughout the interviews, but one of the frequent questions that you have throughout this written interview series is the three intellects posit. And for anyone who doesn't know, that there are three types of intellects: functionary, creationary, and visionary. And functionary is the first. It is what its name implies, are the other two. Creationary is kind of like functionary 2, and visionary is kind of like functionary 3 or creationary 2.
Squared or
who
cubed?
do you think? Sorry?
Squared or cubed? Imagine
Yes.
functionary intellect is the everyday intellect. You're walking down a street and you can rationalize what you're seeing. The second one, the creationary, is being able to see down the street, but then also around a corner. And then the third one, think of being able to see down the street, around the corner, but also X-ray vision through the building to see something deep and essential. So that's basically it. And yeah, a lot of people have a lot of problems with that.
And who do you think out of this? Do you think that any of these written interviews qualifies as visionary? Because I would say no.
No.
And
no.
Then who do you think are the creationaries and who are the functionaries?
I think Pete Hamill had some creative creationary stuff. Charles Johnson, obviously, in his best writings. James Manuel has that. Jack Horner was someone who was a high functionary. Someone like a Philip Lopate was very functionary. Desmond Morris maybe would come the closest, let's see, just going through, he was number 8, to having a visionary tendency, but it's arguable. Leduff, no, he was a very good guy. Brad Steiger, I think, did well in writing about unexplained phenomena. He believes in it, but I think his main value in writing about it is as a chronicler of these silly beliefs. Edward Hoagland, well, he was an atrocity. He was a stuttering old man who sent this atrocious interview because he was pals with Philip Lopate. I remember Lopate wanted to get paid to finish the interview. I'm like, what the fuck are you smoking? And he wanted to be called a novelist, just like Lopate wanted to be called a poet. And I even say in there, your poetry is pretty bad. What am I supposed to? This is one of the reasons I've tried to focus on people without and try to avoid their worst stuff, is because they cannot take that fucking criticism. Philip Lopate is a ridiculously bad poet. Edward Hoagland, I had read part of his book years ago. His novel was published. He had no creationary ability whatsoever. He was an essayist, a good science essayist. Daniel Wallace was a good, solid writer of a few books, but nothing spectacular. George Dickinson was creationary. Mark Rowlands, I wouldn't put him in the visionary sense. He had some inklings that went beyond just the functionary. Richard Thompson Ford did a book on race that was okay. Berardinelli, James Berardinelli was a good, solid, online critic. Patricia Schroeder, after Hoagland, and down there with Lopate as one of the worst interviews. She's a former congresswoman. I don't know why the fuck she wanted to do the interview. She didn't seem to even want to do it. Lee Papa, a terrible interview. He was a guy who was an asshole, who he call himself the rude pundit. And a few people had gotten me to listen to him, so I was like, okay, I think it might have been Alex Sheramet when was that? It might have been Alex who had said he might be someone to interview. He turned out to be a moron and someone who was just in the academy. Jiwei Tu, certainly creationary, arguably visionary painter. Drew Gardner, good solid photographer, not visionary. Lem Dobbs, very creationary. Grabowska, creationary. Gruden, an interesting philosopher. Then a kid interviewed me. Terrence Witt, he had some interesting stuff. He also appeared in one of my video interviews, but not anything visionary. Brian Switek, Larry Sanger, Jemai Kashio, Gregory Paul, Chris Impey, Peniel Joseph, Ed Goshashevsky, the Godzilla expert. These are all, people who are good in what they were doing, but nothing, great. Matthew Pulowski did a very good documentary on Eyes of the Mothman. One could make an argument, I'd have to see if he ever did fictive films, that he might have some visionary tendency. Then Andrew Neil. I remember Andrew Neil, he was another one who reminded me of Dorian Sagan. I was talking about his his grandmother Alice Neal. He did a documentary on her, and he was a bit pissy because I think he had emailed me or something about whether I thought uh, something about whether I thought that I was a great writer. I said, sure, I'm a better writer than forget who I mentioned. He got all pissy about it. I said, well, I can send you the book, and he didn't want to see it or whatnot. But he's one of these people, who's just got this limited view, and they don't want to push themselves. But he reminded me of Dorian Sagan. Then I did a guy named Matt Ogens, Rick Goldsmith. These are more. I did a series with these documentary makers. Then Howard Bloom again gave a very good interview. I don't know if I would put Bloom in the visionary category. I think he has some interesting ideas, and he's certainly a polymath, but I don't think he gets above creationary at best in any of the fields. Stephen Hicks was an interesting guy who did talk about Nietzsche and the Nazis, but he's also an Ayn Randian. And I remember I asked him about, how can you have this interesting take on Nietzsche and then, swallow the pablum of Ayn Rand? And when I asked him a series of questions about Rand that he refused to answer. And it's like, well, you're doing this interview, and about a third of the interview is missing because he didn't want to talk about Ayn Rand. And it's like, I just don't understand that, how someone can be so haughty. He said something in an email to me like, well, you just don't understand Ayn Rand. It's like, what the fuck is there to not understand about Ayn Rand? She's not exactly a great intellect. And then I did an interview with Bruce Ario, David Dessa, who did a recent Dan Schneider video interview. The last one was with Jillian Spitzmiller, who did a documentary. I think she did the documentary about Shakespeare Behind Bars, I think was her documentary. So there's maybe about 4 or 5 people who might have had some visionary in them, maybe about a third to a half that had some creationary, and the rest are just people who are experts in this or that field just on a functionary level.
Before we move on to the video interviews, I want to get some specific things. I'm going to skip over some of these interviews.
Yeah.
You spoke about Pete Hamill. I think he's a good start. This was, I think, the best interview at that point. He was a really relatable guy, very charismatic and interesting. Quite a good writer, too, I must say. I've read some of his stuff. Even in his reportage, he's a very good writer.
Yeah.
But he makes some points, and even he is one of these people who sometimes disagrees with you in the questions, but he does it in a very classy fashion.
And he also mentions that he has limitations. He might not get certain things.
Exactly. So he's more knowing of himself.
Yeah.
He's a very good writer. I do disagree with his points, but even when I disagree with him, I respect him in a way. It was a very good interview. It really shows who Pete Hamill was. Talk a little bit of him as a writer, too, because he is an underrated writer, and I think that some of his best stuff is quite great.
Yeah, I reviewed one of his books, which is a very good book, Forever, I think it was called. Jessica has read 2 or 3 of his other books. I've read more of his essays, and I didn't read his memoir, but I grew up in New York, so I read a lot of his reportage. He's someone that, had he spent more time, I think, actually developing his art as a novelist, could have been one of those novelists on a par with maybe a Mark Twain. He comes from that same kind of background. So, yeah, he was very good. Then I think the next 2 interviews, Pinker and then James Manuel, are really high points.
Absolutely some of the best interviews you'll ever seen from either of them. Steven Pinker, he does avoid certain things for PC reasons.
Yeah.
I do think that's a negative on the interview. When you asked the classic one about Larry the Plumber, and now this is a question about if the Mona Lisa was in a fire and Larry the Plumber was in there, and both were burning, which one would you save? The Mona Lisa for the sake of culture, or Larry the Plumber who doesn't contribute anything to culture? Now, there's ways to answer that. I actually think one of the best answers from that is Alex Sheramitz, who we'll get to in the video interviews, and he basically states that perhaps the human inclination would go towards Larry the Plumber, but the right decision is the Mona Lisa because it progresses culture. So he avoids that. That's a negative on it, but it's such a expansive interview, very concise. You really get into Pinker's mind. Pinker has, over the last few years, been getting worse and worse. He's
Yeah.
not. I don't think that he's heading into the Richard Dawkins school of bigotry, but he is getting worse as a writer and worse as a thinker.
Yeah.
That latest book that he did, The Sense of Style,
Yeah.
is probably his worst book. He has no insight into writing, but he has great insight into the mind, but only on a functionary level.
Right.
He gets it to the nth degree, but he doesn't get into the deeper essence of it.
I remember Alex reviewed that book, and it would be interesting to if I could have like a debate between Alex and Pinker about that book. Yeah, it's a classic example with Pinker in that book of someone going way beyond their purview. I mean, you're not going to hear me try to write a book about Malaysian lepidoptery. I'm not going to write a book about post-Soviet Romanian politics. It doesn't interest me. I couldn't do it justice even if it interested me. I don't. Well, I probably could, but it doesn't interest me, and it's beyond my care. So why someone like Pinker would write about that and then so totally fail in that book it's amazing to me, and it argues
against. The thing is, though, if you did a book about a subject that was out of your purview, you would research the hell out of it and get insight into it, and then make a great book out of it. But Pinker just gives these half-assed thoughts. He's in a subject that he hasn't developed any insight into, and yet and some of the examples that I got into this argument online with someone over it, where he was speaking about these two examples that Pinker raised up of good writing. There was one really bad piece of writing. It was just purple prose, and then there was a Richard Dawkins segment. And the clear reason that he put the Richard Dawkins segment out there was simply because they're friends.
And he agreed with
those. He's just promoting a friend. But the Richard Dawkins one was just as bad in a different way. It was full of cliches. It had sand grains and all this unborn ghost crap that he was speaking about. And Richard Dawkins was once a great writer, but has since become a terrible writer over the last 20 years.
He was never a great writer. He was a good, competent science writer who had good ideas.
He was a good writer. He was certainly not a great
writer. I remember the thing you're talking about. It's Pinker tried to say that because in his metaphor, Dawkins made the sand grain specific to Arabia or something, that it somehow undercut the cliche. He didn't have any clue about what really undercuts a cliche. What that did was, by adding that specificity, it made the cliche stick out like the proverbial sore thumb even more. So it actually highlighted it. The very thing that Pinker thought undercut the cliche actually made the cliche more highlightable and worse. And that showed that Pinker doesn't understand the mechanics of metaphor and what is a good metaphor, what is a cliche, because a cliche isn't just a bad saying. It's just, a cliche is a familiar saying used in a familiar trope in a familiar way. It has to have those three categories. The familiar, a bleeding heart, used in a familiar setting, say a love poem, in a familiar way, say after someone has broken up. So you have to have those three things for something to be a cliche.
The next interview is James and Manuel. You have a opening before the interview that kind of takes on some of the best quotes of the interview. This was a great interview. It was maybe his last hurrah of any good writing that he did, and probably some of the best writing that he did of the last 20 or so years of his life.
Yeah.
But it's excellent. It shows some of the poems. You get into the mechanics of it. It also shows that James, while it may have been more intuitive than it was great technical skill, he did get his poems. He could compare with others. He does have, like Charles Johnson, some PC inclinations where he will not name and refuses to name bad poets.
Yeah.
But I will say that this is quite a good intro to the man. I think that people will look at this interview as the real as well as that first essay you wrote of him. And it also has a bonus essay towards the end. Talk a bit about James's interview. I would put him with Robert Hayden as the two best black poets I've ever read. And top 5 black writers, period. And the thing about that is he is simply he does not distinguish himself as a black poet. Even when he writes on black only topics, they're done in deep fashion.
Well, in
And
his
the whole
best
great
poems,
poems, he even some of the lesser stuff, he'll have moments in them, and he also has an ability to go from formal verse to free verse very fluidly.
in his best poems, in his later, some of his later writings, he got more of that what's it, Gwendolyn Brooks type bullshit. It is a great interview. James, like I said, was out of touch with a lot of what was going on in America, so he didn't know a lot of that stuff. This one, I remember some of the people on the E-list, or some of the people who on the E-list who were also Wikipedia editors, had tried to add in some of the information, because at this point James had like 2 lines in his Wikipedia page, and these asshole editors, because it was coming from Cosmoetica, were removing it. And I remember even James was pissed about that, because the people who he knew were saying they keep removing his stuff, and it's like, this is firsthand or secondhand. It's me asking James. James is giving it to me. I'm a legitimate source. These, for example, these interviews, and also the interviews that I do on the videos, this is journalism too that I'm doing. So you can say I'm a journalist. Cosmoetica is doing more historical journalism about the arts than any other website going, and yet these idiots would remove that stuff. Some of the stuff, I think, and let me just digress. I think some of the things Pinker had said, some Pete Hamill was another one, and then there was a few other people later on, like Charlie Leduff's stuff that was removed. Desmond Morris, a lot of stuff about people's date of birth, even just plain facts that they state in these interviews, were removed by these assholes on Wikipedia, just because for some reason there were some people that there was that thing where the Roger Ebert thread, where there was that website, Empire website. There were some assholes there, and also there was this young kid that I called this young kid, I forget his name, who was constantly just vandalizing not only my page, but any pages that people were adding basic information from Cosmoetica. So with these interviews, I just remember the bad taste I had with these Wikipedia trolls. Why are you removing stuff about James, this important American literary figure? Some asshole who knows nothing about literature, knows nothing about James, a legitimate source right from the horse's mouth that I'm putting online, direct, correct information is being removed for no reason at all. So
part of that too is that you pissed off Wikipedia, and I've noticed that even in segments where they do use quotations from your interviews or quotations from your essays, they will not credit you. So they don't even want to give linkage to you. They just want to take a little bit of parts and lazily edit it around there. And Wikipedia is one of the great fraud sites out there. It's full of misinformation all through it. You can go week to week in some things and find different things on it and totally edited different segments. If you compare, like if you take any of the presidents from America and look at their Wikipedia pages 5 years ago and then look at them now, there's whole bits of information that have completely changed, whole paragraphs that have changed. That's because when you have an open system like that, you get a lot of idiots who are putting in superficial, silly information and removing the meat of it.
Yeah, and even stuff on my own Wikipedia page, stuff that's been gleaned from some of these interviews and the City Pages thing and the New York Times thing or whatnot. People just remove it willy-nilly, and it's like, there's absolutely no sense of journalistic standards there. Why would you want to have false information when here Cosmoetica is giving you the correct information? And they tried to say that it was me, even though I remember one time I think they tried to remove I think it was my Wikipedia page. They did it 2 or 3 times, and I remember, I think it was Alex or someone had sent me an email, or maybe it was Dylan Wall, that they're trying to remove my page, and there was like a whole thing for these idiot editors, like, that were claiming that I was on there 24/7 battling with them in some flame war, and they were supposedly tracking this thing. And at the time, I'm here living here in Texas, and they're saying, "Oh, he just crossed over the state line from Missouri to Nebraska. We're following him through the." And it's like, these people are sick. I mean, number one, even if they could, I mean, that they would think that I was somehow in Iowa traveling across state lines to Nebraska to pretend I was someone else is mind-boggling. But this is the way they work. But I remember, I think it was the James interview. I think some information on Hamill and Pinker had gone unnoticed, but I think it's because James has been 98% promoted by me. 98% of what you'll find online about James and Manuel is directly from Cosmoetica or from stuff derived from Cosmoetica. Without Cosmoetica, James would just have the Negro and maybe 3 or 4 other little things online. That's
That
it.
damn New York Times article on him too had all sorts of misinformation
Yeah.
in it.
And I'm the one who had to correct it. That's corrected because of me.
Then the next interview I want to speak of is Desmond Morris. This is arguably at least the top tier of the interviews. He is, as you stated before, the only one who really gets outside of him. He seems to have real deep inclinations to all sorts of things, not just his expertise. He makes some of the most interesting statements of, not just the Naked Ape itself, but all sorts of human inclinations and talks of them in a deep fashion. He also is very witty. He can turn a nice phrase here or there. I have read The Naked Ape. I think it is a seminal book, and it has also some deep ideas that we will probably be referencing years on as correct.
Yeah, I'm just looking here. I talk about him. Yeah, it was like over 30 years since he'd given an interview. And the only reason he did so, I recall, was because he was impressed by the Pinker interview. I think it was the Pinker interview that convinced him to do it. And then I forget what the error was. I talk about him having an error in there. I forget what the error that he had. And I remember he was like, "Oh yes, that is incorrect," and I think he actually appreciated that. So yeah, that was I'm not even sure if Desmond Morris is still alive. He may be dead. I don't know. He was quite old. I think he was in his early to mid 70s, so he could be dead by now. But that was a terrific interview. And then I had another good one after that, the Charlie Leduff interview. And Leduff had some controversy because he had shared a Pulitzer Prize with 3 or 4 others for some reason, and he had been accused of making some shit up or something, or not coming clean about something. And I forget the particulars of it, but he gave a really great interview about journalism, about the couple of books of his that I'd read. And so, yeah, he did terrifically on that.
There are also some excellent examples of quality writing that is deceptively simple. I was talking to Neil Hester or rather, I'm going to be speaking to him, but he sent me an email and talked about the term spezzatura, which is the ease with which an artwork conveys itself, and also the deceptively simple ways of doing that. Charlie Duff has some terrific pieces that don't even seem that well written on the surface, but how each line connects with the other one really shows a good hand with poesy. It's reportage kind of writing, but it's very good reportage. The next interview of note is with Mark Rowlands. He, along with a couple of your poems, has
I would disagree. Let me point out one. I think the interview with George Dickerson that right before that is another one that's a really great interview. George's written interview reminds me of the video interview that I did with the Genghis Khan guy and also the Oswald Spengler guy. It's almost like a performance piece. I think it shows what a kind of writer at his best George might have become had he not had a 25 or 30-year writing block. So I would disagree. I think the next one, George's interview, is a really great one too. I ding it half a star because he's a little bit reticent about naming bad people in the film industry.
Well, George Dickinson was a notable interview. I was just skipping that one to get to Rollins because this is an interview that sparked one of another common trope throughout your interviews, which is the river of selves. And the river of selves is a very nice condensed version of how a person progresses. You've also have several of your poems where you'll talk about how every 3 or 4 years the body's cells completely alter and change the person for what they are, and you mean it in a metaphorical and a literal sense. This is not just an interview, but also doubles as a debate, because there are some philosophical queries where you'll disagree with him, and it's really back and forth. This one feels very conversational, and I also wanted to mention that Rollins has... Okay, so we're talking about Mark Rollins. I did skip the George Dickinson interview.
Yeah.
It's good that you mentioned him too, because it is a worthwhile interview. But I want to speak about it because Mark Rollins states in here, and this is a common trope throughout your interviews, of the river of selves. You have a few of your poems too that kind of evoke that, in how the cells change every 3 or 4 years and how a whole human is different after that. Yeah. Mark Rollins' interview too also doubles as a debate, and I think it is the most conversational way. There is a later one that we'll get to later, but it's the most conversational, and even when you're disagreeing in philosophical senses, you really get an insight into both of your minds. This is in a way a good portrait of yourself too, and how you think in philosophical terms. And Mark Rollins is also a terrific writer in the sense that he can take something like it states here in the intro that he goes from Arnold Schwarzenegger and Life's Meaning to Evil and Sisyphus. He'll take something that's very low, like a silly action film, and he'll raise it to a higher standard, and he'll communicate it very well. So he's a excellent philosophical writer, and I put him even above someone like Nietzsche, perhaps at his height, because The Philosopher and the Wolf is the best distilled, purely philosophical take on any philosophy that I've read. It's the most well written. It has the most poesy, and it is an excellent take on all sorts of things, and it's most multifaceted as well.
Yeah, I mean, it's a good interview, and he doesn't write in a way that is standoffish. Your typical college kid could read that interview and get something, and that's the way his books are. Like the book that I found him on was on science fiction. I forget the name of the book off the top of my head, but and then I read I think he sent me a copy of The Philosopher of the Wolf and the Wolf, and so yeah, I mean that, and it shows that you can get interesting stuff, good interviews from a lot of different perspectives. So yeah, that was one of the best ones too.
We're gonna take a big step down in this next interview with playwright Lee Papa. Now, this is an interview that is saved only from his correspondence later with you, because it does become a good portrait of the little sickening creature that he is. If you go through this interview, he half-asses most of the interviews. He gets indignant too that you sent him so many interviews when he already had a template of what the kind of interviews you had, and then he threatens to lie and say that he never did, and then you go to prove that he is a liar by posting this correspondence with him. We don't need to get too much into it, but this is one of the advantages, I think, of the video interview. If you had someone like this in a video capacity, I think that his lack of talent with words would be saved by him being able to orate it. And even though the interviews have long extended queries, although a bit more condensed in the video format, I think that would be better for this type of mind. This one is almost impossible to save because he just doesn't have a way with words, and he has such a standard way of thinking of all sorts of things.
Yeah, and the guy obviously got caught up in his own self-styled persona of being sort of the Howard Stern of left-wing politics and blogs. I don't even know. This is like maybe 2009 or 2010 this interview happened. I don't even know if he's still online doing this stuff. I can't imagine doing such shallow stuff and whatnot. And that's not to say he didn't have some good points within his blogs, and he'd rip someone on it, but it was predictable. And I think it was Alex Sheremet who first got me, who mentioned it to me. Oh, if it wasn't him, it was maybe someone else on the E list. Maybe it was this guy from Africa who I had mentioned got a little wacky later on. But yeah, Papa just comes off. He, I would hate to have to sit through a play that he wrote because it's probably not good. Um, he seemed to offer nothing, and I think someone, it might have been Keith Jackowitz. Keith had sent me a link one time to, there's several sites called like ratemyprofessor.com or something, and apparently he got a lot of low ratings from most of his students because they said he was so full of himself. And I remember I did get an email. I don't know if I put it on there. I got an email from a woman who claimed that she had been a student of his and he had been very nasty to her or whatnot. And she liked the interview only because it showed what an asshole he was. But yeah, there's really not much to say other than that, along with Lopate, Edward Hoagland, Congresswoman Patricia Schroeder, and Papa are probably the four bad interviews. They were just bad interviews. Lopate had a few points here or there. His was the best of those four. But you wonder why these people even agreed to be interviewed. They didn't put any effort to, and Papa too only answered about 2/3 of the questions. There was anywhere from 25 to 40% of the questions he didn't answer, and I could tell, and I think I said it in the email exchange. Clearly, he didn't even know or understand what I was talking about. It's not like he ignored them because they were too personal. Whatnot. They clearly went over his head.
Next interview is Sway 2. This is not a great interview. It is a good one. But the reason I want to point this out is because of how great his paintings really are. I think people should look at Sway 2's work. How do you compare him to some of the great modernists of the 20th century? Because I think that he has some paintings that can stand up with the best of them.
Well, yeah, I mean, he's a great painter. I think I mentioned earlier, Jessica and I had been, one day we were in Marble Falls, Texas. It's a small town that's about 40 miles west of Austin, and we went there, and we might have gone there to hear some guy play music or something, and at the restaurant, there was an art gallery across the street or across the parking lot from it, and I went in. We saw the typical Texas paintings of horses and Western scenery, and then boom! I remember being about 20 feet away. I saw the first painting. I think it was the farmer in the hat or something, or it might have been the one of the little girl. But I saw these two paintings, and boom, boom! It's like woo! It's like the movie. It brings it right up to you, and you're like wow, that's something. He did most of his stuff is portraits. He did some bigger paintings of stuff. Just he gets the idea of there's a moment, and why am I in that moment? Why am I looking at this face? And yeah, I think his son helped him answer in English. But it's one of those things
There's
that
no one like him too in painting. He has such an individuated style, and it's very striking when you first
it's almost like his portraits, the faces of the characters, sort of pop out from the canvas.
Yes.
And you'd see that even more if you actually see the paintings in person.
Despite the kinetic moments, there are little moments where a character simply looks aside or something. You can get an insight into that little moment as well as the kinetic energy around it.
Yeah.
The next interview, and perhaps the best of all of them, is Lem Dobbs. This is the screenwriter of Limey and Dark City. It is, I think, the longest interview, correct? Yeah. And he really goes all out on it. He is very loquacious, and he speaks on his whole filmic history as a watcher and as a screenwriter, and you get into some of the aspects of his films. I think The Limey, by the way, is one of the best films of the last 25 years. It's Soderbergh's
best film that I've seen by far.
and it has one of the best performances too.
Yeah.
I think I've ever seen by Terrence Stamp.
Yeah.
It's a shame that it's underrated. Dark City is similarly underrated, but it has a cult following at least. Limey is the superior film, and it deals with memory in a different way. All of Lem Dobbs' work is based on memory, and you get into that, but he's also very fun in how he goes about this interview, and
Well,
it is like a novella-sized interview.
I mentioned George Dickerson's sort of performance art interview. Lem Dobbs is in a similar kind of vein with that. And just like with Desmond Morris, Lem Dobbs only did the interview because I had sent him links to prior interviews. So he wanted to be a part of this interview series. He's someone that, as far as I know, he's done some videos, audio interviews here or there, but never did a written interview. At least not anything of this depth. So he did that because of that. So yeah, it's something that he goes off on these sort of tangents, these sort of what's James Joyce, the automatic writing,
Stream of
consciousness, automatic writing kind of thing. And then an interview that should be pointed out is the John Grabowska interview, the documentarian. Yes. That's another one that I gave 5 stars, and he's just very blunt and very. He's probably the person in the arts talking about films and documentaries that he's not giving any bullshit.
He is also, I mean, there's no one in fictional films that is really up to standard with the greats of the past. Some have either lapsed, like Woody Allen or Martin Scorsese, or are dead, like Orson Welles and Stanley Kubrick. Terrence Malick is another one, but his films have gone to hell recently. But John Grabowska probably is, in America, the best filmmaker still living and working, even as a short documentary maker. His films are like Lauren Isley distilled on there. He takes influence from Lauren Isley, and I think that out of all these interviews, in terms of the filmic ones, this is the interview that people will come back to and say, that's where he was discovered, because he has films that are completely different. And you did a recent video interview that we'll get to perhaps later about NPR and PBS, and you spoke about the Burns brothers and how standard their formula of documentary making is. John Grabowska annihilates either of them at any point in their career in just 20 minutes or so that he has for a documentary. They're very distilled. And Crown of the Continent, by the way, which is the first film of his that I've seen, is one of the best films of this century. It is an absolute masterpiece of film. It has so many different layers, and it's such a concise fashion.
I would say the one thing I would disagree with, I think the film that Rick Burns, not Ken Burns, but that Rick Burns did about Moby Dick and the Downing of the Essex is the best of the Burns brothers films. And even though it does hew to the Burns brothers style, it is one of those works that is sort of like Stopping by Woods on a Snowy Evening to Robert Frost, or Ozymandias to Shelley, in that both of those people did uniformly good quality poetry, but that's a work that's aside and apart. And I think it's called Into the Deep. I would put that Rick Burns documentary, even though it's longer and it used the Burns Brothers style, what's his name? Grabowska doesn't have anything that long. So I don't know if Grabowska could sustain a film for 2 hours or 2.5 hours, it might be, even that documentary. So to a certain extent, I would agree that Grabowska, he's gotten the half-hour poetic documentary, and I think he said that there are some 45, 50-minute versions of those films that he has cuts of. I don't know.
Yeah, I want to see him do something longer and more condensed in that fashion. But even though I would agree, because I have seen Into the Deep as well as other Burns documentaries, I would agree you may be able to rank it above anything Grabowska has done. But if you take any similar length moment in Into the Deep and compare it to Crown of the Continent, I believe that Crown of the Continent is the superior film. There's really no fat. It has so many different layers. I certainly, by length though, you would probably have to give Into the Deep the slight edge. And then there's your interview with Andrew Goldman. This is one of the first things that I had seen when I discovered your site, and it linked me to some of your poems.
Oh, really?
And it has some. It shows how you can kind of go on tangent yourself. This is in a way like Lem Dobbs, but it's more impressive in its own way because, well, Lem Dobbs had great questions to go off of. These ones are these are good questions, but you go on many different tangents from that, and you're able to expand off of just a simple question. It's the same impulse that drives Lem Dobbs. You may want to speak about this, but Lem Dobbs wants to talk about 50 other tangents related to it. And this is something that is a good into because it's very comprehensive. It has your website, it has your personal life, it has the poetry, the later books, your criticism. Speak a little bit of this interview. How did this fellow get in touch with you? And he takes a few of the questions that you used and he spins them off as his own. I think these are very good questions, but it also is far better just based on the way that you answer them and get into the absolute depth.
I think he only asked 10 questions. He's like you or Alex Sheremet or any of the other people on the E-list. He's someone who does email me out of the blue. I think he had, I don't remember if he had them in a question format. I think he might have wanted to, I think he wanted to publish them for his college in a thing. A few years later, I got a couple of kids who wanted to have me come to their college to speak to them, but that fell through when they went to present it to the people who ran the college. This kid wanted to publish this, and I think he published it in some college journal. I forget which college university he was going to. And they're good, solid questions, so I answered them. But I was aware of the idea to give more of an experience rather than just just rote answers. Not that I could even really give rote answers, but yeah, I can't put it in a league with some of the 5-star interviews. It's just as good as my answers are. I'm too moored to the diurnal.
Yeah. The poetry segments I think are very instructive simply because it's interesting how you view your corpus as having no real highs but just a uniformity to it.
Yeah.
At least in poetry. We've spoken a bit about your prose on and off camera, but you seem to be able to easily distinguish your highs there, whereas with your poetry, it's much more uniform, and the corpus it's its own best accomplishment. That's something that really drove insight to that. And it's also interesting, too, in the fact that if you look at your poems instead of just looking at your essays, which I think most people, based on that Roger Ebert interview, are interested to, they give more credence to what you say, because if you read Siamese Reflection and you get its greatness, you can then understand why this person is able to declaim on various poetic and not topics as well as you do.
Yeah, I was just thinking you were talking about the poetry and whatnot. I lost the point I was going to make. But I mean, it's a good interview, and I forgot the point I was going to make. So sometimes you go on so long, I'm about to jump in and I forget my point. But go on, ask your next question.
Sure. It's Brian Switek is the next.
Switek.
Yes. He has this is similar to some of the other scientific ones. I don't know exactly how you go about rating these things. I would give this more. I think he's very comprehensive, but he's less. He has less leaps than Desmond Morris or Steven Pinker, so I would give this more 4.5. It has some excellent moments. He's very open about his field, and he's a younger fellow too, isn't he? He wrote for one of those science blog sites and declaimed on that. Talk a little bit about this interview.
Well, I gave it the 5 stars because he talks about science and the business of science, if I recall. So he's not He's sort of pulling down the curtain behind the wall of science to a degree that someone like Morris, by the nature of the interview, didn't do, or Pinker, or that. Um, yeah, I mean, you could argue 4.5, 5. I remember it was a good interview. It reminded me of one of my video interviews that I did with this guy who was in a debate with Jack Horner. Uh, that I think it was the ninth video interview. He reminded me very much of that fellow, or they remind me of each other. I don't even remember much about it. I remember it's about paleontology, and um, yes, I don't really remember much except that I was very impressed that at a young age he was talking freely, and he was talking very openly. He's certainly a lot less, a lot more concise than Rollins or Pinker or George Dickerson or some of the others. But there are different types of ways to have a good or a great interview, and that's one of the things. Jessica, I know when we talk about things, I think sometimes she, like I said, she sometimes tries to justify people's poems, but there are other ways to get to be great in something, and that's one of the things I realize that a lot of other people don't realize. Whether it's a great interview or a great poem or a great piece of writing or something. Oh yeah, I remember the point now. The thing we're talking about, the uniformity of the poetry. Well, that's because you haven't seen, the 10 or 12 notebooks of poetry that I did before I wrote my first great poem. I'm talking just about the poems that became great, that basically are the stuff that William Glass had put in that PDF. When it comes to my books, it's easier to point out the sustained nature of the books. I mean, I don't know how much farther you've read into a Norwegian in the Family, but you can't read 100, 200 pages into that book without being just sort of like ripped into the writing and the narrative and whatnot. I'm getting to the point in this spy book that I mentioned in other interviews too, where I'm coming to the end. I've got most of the chapters done, except for about 5 or 6 that I have to work on and fluff up. Give it the sort of yeast, get it, and then I'll go through it. But I can tell this is going to be probably my third best book behind Norwegian and uh, the Vincetti brothers, but only because of size. If you were to take any, say, 300,000 words, this is right now at about 261,000 words. If I were to take any 250,000 word segment from a Norwegian in the Family or from the Vincetti brothers, this book as a whole is equal to, or maybe even a little bit better than any 250,000 segment from those books. It's just you can't diminish the fact that let's say if I wrote a 100,000 word book that I rank as 99.8 or 99.9 on a 100 scale, it can't be as great a book, though, say, as a 2 million word book that maybe only is a 97 overall, because you can't diminish the import of the sustained nature. Endurance, whether it's in sports, an endurance record in sports versus, say, hitting a ball 500 feet, baseball 500 feet, which is impressive in a different way, that you have to account for some of those things. So I always, when I look at my poetry, it does have the ups and downs, even in that document that William scanned in. But instead of being like an earthly terrestrial mountain range where you're getting peaks and valleys, it's more like sort of Olympus Mons, Mount Olympus on Mars, in which that's a mountain that's 2 times as high above the surface level of Mars as, say, Everest is at its point. The difference is Venus Mons, as a mountain, it's almost like a big lump if you've ever seen it on Mars. It doesn't stick up like a mountain with a peak. It's sort of like a big pimple. And so you once you get up, I think it's something like 70,000 feet above the surface of Mars. Once you get up to about 65, 66,000 feet, the top peak of it is like the size of Texas or something. It's that big. So it doesn't look as impressive in a sense. If you were to look at Olympus Mons, the mountain, it doesn't look as impressive because it doesn't rise as sharply as Everest or the Matterhorn does. but it's larger and more spread out in that way. So that's the analogy I would use. But anyway, go on to the next interview.
There's several more good interviews interspersed afterwards. I think the last really good one was Howard Bloom's interview.
Yeah.
It has, as typical, he's very loquacious. He speaks of, let's see, what was a specific thing that he spoke about. But you get into the God problem, why a godless cosmos creates, and I've read that book. It's a terrific book, even despite its flaws. Speak a little bit of Howard Bloom. Like you said, he's the only one that has appeared in all three iterations of your interviews. How do you see him at contrast from his written to his auditory and visual appearances?
When he's writing on subjects that he knows about, and he was taking a scientific approach to writing, he's very good. I had to give a negative review to his memoir, even though it has says some interesting things about his life and person. He was trying to be, it was almost like he was stuck in the 1960s and was trying to do sort of like a psychedelic film version of his life in print, and it just didn't work. I much prefer when he's writing at the top of his game than when he's doing, like, I've seen some of his YouTube things about whatever political is going on. He did come off, I think, very well in the four-man debate about alternatives to Big Bang cosmology. But yeah, this is another one of those interviews that's sort of like the Lem Dobbs or the George Dickerson interview, where you essentially get the man. I mean, it's so Bloomian, and even if he was just, not as bright as he is, you'd get a sense of the person from the way he answers the questions and structure shit.